That ring was never really yours, Marlo. Family things should go to family who'll actually use them. That was my mother, Denise, standing in my own kitchen 3 days before my wedding, holding my grandmother's ring up to the light like she was appraising it for a pawn shop. I didn't say anything at first. I just watched the way the diamond caught the light and thought about how strange it was that the last thing my grandmother ever gave me was now sitting in my mother's palm like it had always belonged there. What my parents didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the ring on my mother's hand wasn't the real one. It hadn't been for months. And by the time they figured out what they'd actually stolen, they would have already lost something far more valuable than a piece of jewelry. My name is Marlo Kessler. Everyone calls me Wren, a nickname my grandmother gave me when I was 7 because she said I flitted around her garden like I was looking for somewhere to land. I'm 29 years old, and for most of my life, I was the daughter who didn't quite fit the shape my parents wanted. My mother, Denise, worked as a loan officer for a regional bank and measured love the way she measured collateral, by what you could offer in return. My father, Grant, ran a hardware store his own father had built, and he believed that steady and quiet meant good, and that anything else meant trouble. I was not steady and quiet. I asked questions. I noticed things. I grew up to investigate insurance fraud for a living, which my mother liked to describe at parties as something with paperwork, as if my entire career could be folded into a shrug. My younger sister, Paisley, was the daughter they understood. She was 3 years younger than me, effortlessly likable, the kind of person who could walk into a room and rearrange the furniture just by smiling at it. When Paisley wanted something, my parents found a way to give it to her, and when Paisley failed at something, my parents found a way to call it someone else's fault. 2 years ago, when her first engagement fell apart, they threw her a $12,000 healing trip to Portugal and told relatives she needed rest. When I got promoted to senior investigator that same month, my mother asked if it meant I'd finally have benefits. The one person who never made me feel like an afterthought was my grandmother, Odette. She was my father's mother, sharp-tongued and unbothered by anyone's opinion of her, including her own son's. She used to tell me that watching people reveal themselves was the most reliable form of entertainment left in the world, and she was right more often than I wanted her to be. Odette had a ring, an emerald-cut diamond set in rose gold that had belonged to her own mother, appraised years later at just over $42,000, though she always said its real value had nothing to do with the number. She wore it every day of her life until her hands got too thin to keep it on, and then she kept it in a small velvet box on her nightstand, where I used to sit with her on Sunday afternoons while she told me stories about people who thought they could outsmart her. When Odette passed away 18 months ago, her will was specific in a way that surprised everyone but me. The ring was left to me by name, along with a handwritten note that the estate attorney read aloud in front of my entire family. It said, "For the one who never had to compete for love, but never got it anyway." I remember the silence in that room afterward, the particular quality of silence that comes from people trying to look gracious while quietly recalculating what they believe they're owed. My mother's mouth had tightened into a thin, polite line. My father had stared at the floor. And Paisley, freshly heartbroken from her broken engagement, had looked at me with an expression I hadn't understood yet, but would come to recognize very well over the following months. It was the look of someone deciding that something belonged to them, regardless of what any piece of paper said. I didn't think much of it at the time. I told myself grief does strange things to people, that resentment fades, that family finds its way back to something resembling peace. I wore the ring on a chain around my neck for a while, then eventually had it resized and started wearing it properly, the way Odette always had. I didn't know yet that my mother had already started asking to just try it on sometimes. I didn't know that somewhere in the last 18 months, quietly and patiently, my family had decided the ring was never really mine to keep. Theo proposed to me on a Tuesday, which he still apologizes for as if there's a correct day of the week for asking someone to marry you. We planned a small wedding, nothing extravagant, just people who actually mattered to us, at a vineyard about an hour outside the city. My mother had opinions about the guest list, opinions about the flowers, opinions about whether emerald rings photographed well next to a white dress, and I absorbed all of it the way I'd absorbed most things from her my whole life, by nodding and doing what I'd already planned to do anyway. What I didn't absorb, what I let sit in the back of my mind like a splinter I hadn't dealt with, was the way she kept circling back to the ring itself. You should let Paisley wear it for the engagement photos, just once, for old time's sake. It seems like such a shame for something that beautiful to just sit in a box most days. Your grandmother would have wanted the whole family to enjoy it, not just you. I run fraud investigations for a living. I spend my days reading the small, careful ways people justify taking things that don't belong to them, watching the language shift from request to entitlement to inevitability. I recognized the pattern in my own mother's mouth before I wanted to admit it. So for months before the wedding, quietly, without telling anyone, I took the ring to an appraiser I trusted, had it formally documented and photographed for insurance purposes, and had a jeweler craft a nearly identical replica in cubic zirconia, the kind of thing that would fool anyone who wasn't looking closely with a loupe. I put the real ring in a safe deposit box at my own bank, the one my mother didn't work at, and I started wearing the replica every day. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself I hoped I was wrong. 3 days before the wedding, my parents came to my apartment for what my mother called one last family dinner before everything gets busy. Paisley came too, which should have told me something on its own, since Paisley and I hadn't had dinner together in months. We ate, we made small talk about seating charts, and then, almost gently, almost like an afterthought, my mother reached across the table and asked to see the ring one more time before the big day. I slipped it off and handed it to her, the fake, watching her turn it in the light the way she'd probably watched 1,000 loan applications, looking for the thing that would let her say yes to herself. She didn't give it back. She just kept it in her closed hand, and after a long moment she said the words that opened this story. That ring was never really yours, Marlo. Family things should go to family who'll actually use them. I asked her what that meant, and she said it plainly, like she was reading off a form. Paisley should have it. Paisley needed something to look forward to after her engagement fell apart, and I already had Theo, I already had my happy ending, and it seemed only fair that the ring go to the daughter who needed it more. My father didn't look up from his plate. "It's just a ring, Marlo," he said. "Don't make this a thing." Paisley didn't even pretend to be uncomfortable. She was already holding out her hand, and my mother was already sliding the fake ring onto her finger, and I watched my sister admire a piece of cubic zirconia under my own kitchen light like it was the resolution to every unfairness she'd ever imagined she'd suffered. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I sat there and watched my family divide up something that had never belonged to any of them to divide, and I felt something in me go very still and very clear, the way it does at work when a case finally stops being confusing and starts being simple. I told them I needed to start cleaning up, and they left not long after, Paisley practically floating out the door with her hand extended in front of her like she was carrying something fragile and holy. My father hugged me on the way out, told me I was being mature about this, that he was proud of how I was handling it. I let him believe that. What none of them understood was that I had already taken the only thing that mattered off the table months ago, and what I was about to do next had nothing to do with a piece of jewelry at all. What my parents didn't know, what none of them had ever known, was that I had been quietly holding 2 pieces of leverage over our family for years, both of which I had built not out of malice but out of love, back when I still believed love was something you protected people with instead of something you kept score of. The first went back 3 years, to when my father's hardware store nearly went under during a slow winter and the bank threatened to call in the loan on my parents' house. My mother, for all her talk about collateral and security, had let their mortgage fall behind without telling anyone, too proud to ask for help, too afraid of what it would mean about her if she did. I found out by accident, through a coworker who mentioned my parents' name in a file that crossed her desk. I didn't tell them I knew. I went to their bank, quietly, and I bought the note myself through a private arrangement my lawyer helped structure, effectively becoming the lender on my own parents' house without either of them realizing it. I told myself it was protection, a safety net in case the bank tried to move faster than they could recover. I never touched it. I never mentioned it. For 3 years, I paid down pieces of it in the background and let them believe they'd simply gotten lucky with a forgiving lender. The second thing was newer and darker, and I had been sitting on it the way you sit on something you hope you'll never actually need. 8 months earlier, in the course of an unrelated investigation at work, I had come across a homeowner's insurance claim filed under my father's name for storm damage to the store roof. The signature on it wasn't his. I recognized the handwriting immediately. The particular slant Paisley had never quite grown out of since she signed hall passes for me in high school when I skipped class to sit with Grandma Odette. She had forged our father's name, inflated the damage estimate, and pocketed a difference of almost $9,000, money that as far as I could tell she'd used to help pay for a designer dress and a photographer for an engagement that ended before the wedding ever happened. I never reported it. I told myself I was protecting her, protecting my parents from the fallout, protecting some version of family I still wanted to believe existed. I filed the documentation quietly in a drawer of my own life and hoped I would never have to open it again. The morning after that dinner, I sat at my kitchen table with my coffee going cold and made 2 calls. The first was to my lawyer, instructing him to formally call the note on my parents' house due in full within 30 days, citing a clause that allowed it in the event of a demonstrated breakdown in the good faith relationship the loan had originally been structured around. It was not a lie. It was, if anything, the most honest sentence I had written about my family in years. The second call was to a colleague in compliance, not to file a report yet, but to quietly reopen the flag on Paisley's claim and let the automated system begin generating the standard inquiry letters it would have generated 8 months ago if I hadn't buried it. 2 weeks passed. My mother called to ask if I'd heard anything about a strange letter from their mortgage servicer, something about the loan being called due. She was sure it was a clerical error. She'd handled loans for 20 years and had never seen anything like it. I told her I hadn't heard anything, which was true, since I already knew exactly what it said. My father grumbled about incompetent banks and said it would sort itself out the way everything always sorted itself out for him. Paisley, meanwhile, had no idea her old file had resurfaced, and posted a photo to her account of her hand resting on Theo's shoulder at a bridal shower I hadn't invited her to but she'd shown up to anyway, my grandmother's ring, or what she believed was my grandmother's ring, glinting under string lights with the caption "Family Heirloom, finally where it belongs." 41 people liked it before I closed the app. I didn't feel anger looking at it. I felt something closer to inventory, the quiet satisfaction of watching evidence assemble itself without my having to lift a finger. My wedding was 5 days away, and for the first time since my grandmother died, I felt something in my chest that resembled calm instead of grief. Not because I was looking forward to revenge. I want to be clear about that, because it would have been easy to let it curdle into something ugly. I felt calm because I finally understood that I didn't need my family's permission to be whole, and I was about to make sure they understood that too, in front of everyone who mattered to me, on the one day I had built entirely for myself. The morning of the wedding, the vineyard looked like something out of a painting, long rows of vines turning gold at the edges, string lights already strung between the oak trees for the evening, and a soft wind carrying the smell of lavender from the garden beds near the ceremony space. I stood in the small stone cottage that served as the bridal suite, watching my reflection in a mirror that had probably watched 100 other brides have the same mixture of nerves and joy I was feeling, and I slipped the real ring onto my finger for the first time in months. It felt lighter than I remembered, though I knew that was impossible, the same weight of gold and stone it had always been. Maybe it just felt different because for the first time since Odette died, nothing about it was borrowed, hidden, or in question. My parents arrived early, which should have told me something, since punctuality had never been either of their strong suits. I watched from the cottage window as they crossed the gravel path toward the reception tent, my mother in a pale blue dress she'd bought specifically for the occasion, my father adjusting his tie the way he always did when he was nervous about something he wouldn't name. Paisley trailed behind them in a dress far too formal for a guest, her hand already extended slightly in front of her, the replica catching the morning light exactly the way it was designed to. I understood immediately what they'd planned, or at least the shape of it. Quietly return the ring before photos began, let me put it on for the ceremony, and let Paisley keep whatever version of the story she needed to keep for herself. What they hadn't accounted for was that I already had the real one on my hand, and I had no intention of pretending the last 3 days hadn't happened. I met them at the entrance to the reception tent before the ceremony began, before any guests had settled into their seats, while the string quartet was still tuning somewhere behind the hedges. My mother's face shifted the moment she saw my hand, the particular stillness of someone doing rapid math and not liking the answer. "Where did you get that?" she asked, and I watched her look from my hand to Paisley's, the confusion moving through her like weather. I told her the truth, plainly, the way I'd learned to deliver hard facts to people who didn't want to hear them. The ring she'd taken 3 nights ago had never been real. I'd had it replicated months earlier, the moment I noticed she'd started asking to borrow it more than once. The real ring had been in a safe deposit box the entire time, and it was on my hand now, exactly where it was always going to be on this particular morning. My father tried to steer things toward composure, the way he always did, lowering his voice and glancing at the guests beginning to arrive. "You're really going to do this today, Marlo? On your wedding day?" I told him I wasn't doing anything, that I hadn't raised my voice, hadn't caused a scene, had simply told the truth when asked a direct question. My mother, recovering some of her usual footing, reached for the familiar script. "We're your family. Family doesn't do this to each other." I let that sentence sit in the air for a moment before I answered her, because I wanted her to hear exactly how it sounded coming back to her. "You tried to take the one thing Grandma made sure was mine 3 days before my wedding, and told me it was fair because I already had a happy ending. I'm just making sure you understand what family actually costs, since apparently we're keeping a ledger now." I told them about the mortgage note, calmly, without theater, the way I'd deliver findings in any other investigation. That I had quietly held their loan for 3 years, protecting them without their knowledge, and that as of 2 weeks ago, following the events of that dinner, I had exercised my right to call it due in full within 30 days, because a lending relationship built on trust doesn't survive a demonstrated breakdown of that trust. And I had never seen the breakdown demonstrated more clearly than watching my mother take my grandmother's ring off my hand. My mother's face went pale in a way I'd never seen before. My father's jaw tightened, and for the first time in my life, he had nothing to say at all. Then I looked at Paisley, who was still standing there with her hand slightly extended, the fake ring glinting uselessly in the morning sun, and I said the last thing I'd come to say. "You know exactly what I'm talking about with the insurance claim, Paisley. I never filed it. I still haven't. Whether that stays true is still a choice I get to make, and today is not the day I'm deciding it for you." I watched her face fold in on itself, the color draining out of it the way it does when someone realizes the ground they've been standing on was never as solid as they believed. None of them said anything else. I turned, smoothed the front of my dress, and walked toward the aisle where Theo was waiting, because whatever they needed to sit with, they were going to sit with it on their own time, not mine. The ceremony itself was the kind of blur that I imagine most weddings are, a warm rush of vows and Theo's hands steady around mine and the particular relief of finally standing in a moment I'd built entirely for myself. I don't remember every word of what we said to each other, but I remember looking down at my hand while we exchanged rings and feeling the weight of the real one settle against my finger, solid and unborrowed, exactly where it belonged. My parents sat in the second row, still and pale, and Paisley sat beside them with her hands folded in her lap, the fake ring nowhere in sight for the rest of the day. Later, one of my grandmother's oldest friends, a woman named Harriet who had known Odette for nearly 50 years, found me during the reception and told me quietly that she'd overheard part of the conversation near the entrance, and that Odette would have been, in her words, thoroughly entertained. It was such an exact echo of something my grandmother used to say about watching people reveal themselves that I laughed for the first time all day, a real laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere honest. The weeks after the wedding unfolded with a kind of quiet inevitability that almost felt like watching a case close itself. My parents scrambled to refinance the house independently once the note came due, and without my involvement or my rates, they ended up with a far less forgiving lender than the one they'd unknowingly had for 3 years. My mother, a woman who had spent 2 decades telling other people how to manage their debt, found herself sitting across from a loan officer explaining her own late payments, and I understand from a cousin who heard it secondhand that the irony was not lost on anyone in the room except possibly her. I never gained anything from calling the note. I didn't want their money or their house. I wanted them to understand, in a language they had spent their whole lives speaking fluently, exactly what it costs to break trust with someone who has quietly been protecting you. As for the insurance claim, I made my decision about a month later, and it wasn't the one Paisley probably feared most. I didn't report her. I reached out directly instead, told her I knew what she'd done, and gave her 30 days to arrange restitution through the insurer's standard resolution process before I would let the system handle it on its own terms. She paid it back in full within 3 weeks, quietly, without our parents ever finding out the specifics, though I suspect they've pieced together enough to understand the shape of it. It wasn't mercy for her sake alone. It was the last thing I was willing to do as her sister before I stopped being responsible for the consequences of her choices. Our relationship since then has been careful and distant, not cold exactly, but honest in a way it never was before, which I've come to think is its own kind of progress. My parents and I still speak, occasionally, at the edges of holidays and family obligations neither of us quite knows how to abandon completely. But something fundamental shifted that morning outside the reception tent, and no amount of polite conversation since has managed to shift it back. My mother has never apologized, not really, not in the specific way that would mean anything. She's mentioned once or twice, in passing, that she overreacted about the ring, which is the closest she's capable of coming to admitting she was wrong about anything. I've stopped waiting for more than that. I've learned that some people will only ever meet you at the furthest edge of their own capacity for honesty, and expecting more from them is its own kind of self-inflicted wound. I wear the ring every day now, the real one, the one Odette wanted me to have specifically because I never had to compete for love and never got it anyway. Some mornings I catch the light hitting it while I'm making coffee, and I think about her sitting with me on those Sunday afternoons, telling me that watching people reveal themselves was the most reliable form of entertainment left in the world. I understand now what she meant in a way I couldn't have at 7 years old. People will tell you exactly who they are, given enough opportunity and enough at stake. The only real question is whether you're paying close enough attention to believe them the first time. If someone has ever tried to take something from you and called it fair, I hope you find whatever version of the safe deposit box works for your own life. Protect what matters quietly, and let people show you who they are before you hand them anything else to hold.